Along the fog-shrouded coastline of Massachusetts, where whispers of forgotten sins are carried on the Atlantic winds, a crumbling stone marker stands that few dare approach. When they pass it, local fishermen cross themselves, and what it commemorates is something even the boldest historians refuse to speak openly about. Only a date, 1687, and two names are borne by the marker, names that once struck terror into the hearts of every God-fearing colonist. Ezekiel and Judith Harrington. For nearly 2 decades, an empire of blood and accusation was built by these siblings, their wealth growing from the screams of the innocent and the seizure of their properties. But when twin children so grotesquely malformed were produced by their unholy union that even the most hardened physicians fled in horror, the people whispered that divine justice had finally found them. What really happened in that isolated manor house, where 8-year-old children with twisted bodies and brilliant minds plotted against their own parents, remained buried beneath layers of fear and superstition until now. Before the story of the Harrington siblings and their terrible legacy continues, I want you to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, because stories like this one, stories that most people would rather forget, are exactly what we uncover here. Also, let me know in the comments what state or city you're listening from, as every corner of America is scattered with these dark tales. A level of calculated evil that would make even the most hardened observer question what humanity is truly capable of when greed overrides conscience is revealed by the truth about the Harrington fortune and its cursed inheritors. In a state of perpetual religious fervor and economic struggle existed the Massachusetts Bay Colony of the 1660s. On fishing, farming, and an uneasy relationship with the supernatural beliefs that governed every aspect of colonial life survived small coastal communities like Wickham's Harbor, a settlement of barely 300 souls nestled between rocky cliffs and pine forests. Constant vigilance against Satan's influence was demanded by the Puritan doctrine, and in such isolated communities, suspicion could spread faster than wildfire. The sharp features and piercing gray eyes that would later become synonymous with accusation and judgment were possessed by Ezekiel Harrington, at 28 years old. His younger sister, Judith, 25, was equally striking in her austere beauty, sharing the same angular jaw and cold demeanor. But where attention was commanded by Ezekiel through presence, influence was wielded by Judith through whispered words and carefully planted doubts. Unusual education for their station had been received by both siblings. Their father, a failed merchant from Boston, had insisted on teaching them to read, write, and most importantly, to understand the legal intricacies of property ownership and inheritance law. When their parents died of fever in 1663, leaving the siblings with little more than a modest farmhouse and mounting debts, the same bleak prospects as countless other young colonists were faced by them. But unlike their neighbors who turned to honest labor or trade, an opportunity in the growing hysteria surrounding witchcraft was recognized by the Harrington siblings. Throughout New England, communities had begun employing witch-finders, individuals who claimed special knowledge in identifying servants of Satan. Substantial fees for their services could be commanded by these professionals, and more lucratively, portions of the condemned's confiscated property were often received by them. The village of Milford, 2 days' ride inland, was the siblings' first client, where an atmosphere ripe for supernatural explanations had been created by crop failures and stillborn livestock. As a learned man who had studied the signs of witchcraft presented himself Ezekiel, while as his assistant, skilled in the art of detecting hidden marks upon the accused, posed Judith. Brutally simple was their method. They would arrive in a troubled community, study the local dynamics of wealth and power, then systematically accuse those whose properties would prove most profitable once confiscated. Their first victim became the widow, Constance Fletcher, a woman whose late husband had left her a valuable grain mill that several local men coveted. Under the Harrington siblings' careful orchestration, herself accused of blighting the harvest through unholy communion with dark forces, found Constance. Overwhelming seemed the evidence they presented. Mysterious marks upon her body, which they had secretly inflicted during a forced examination, testimony from neighbors who claimed to have seen her muttering strange words, coached by Judith's careful suggestions, and the damning fact that her mill continued to produce flour when others failed, actually the result of her superior maintenance and location. On November 15, 1664, Constance Fletcher was hanged, and her mill was divided between the Town and the Harrington siblings as payment for their services. But merely the beginning of an enterprise that would eventually span 8 different communities and claim the lives of 57 innocent people over the course of 15 years was this. Not from any romantic inclination came the decision for Ezekiel and Judith to marry. Such unions between siblings were technically possible under colonial law when justified by compelling circumstances, but from cold, practical calculation. By 1675, assets worth more than £15,000, an enormous fortune by colonial standards, were controlled by the siblings. They owned property in 9 different communities, held mortgages on dozens of farms and businesses, and possessed detailed records of their various criminal activities spanning more than a decade. The problem they faced was one of inheritance and security. If outside the family either sibling married, legal rights to a portion of their wealth would be gained by their spouse, and more dangerously, potential access to the carefully guarded secrets that had made their fortune possible. Similarly, if without direct heirs either sibling died, their assets might result in being distributed among distant relatives or even claimed by the colonial government through complex inheritance laws. The same ruthless pragmatism that had characterized their entire careers was demonstrated by their solution. Ezekiel, as the elder sibling, would marry Judith in a private ceremony performed by a corrupt minister they had compromised during a witch trial in Salem village. From the wider community, the union would be kept secret. Instead, it was presented as a business partnership between a confirmed spinster and bachelor who had dedicated their lives to serving God through the identification and elimination of supernatural threats. On December 21, 1675, during the winter solstice, a date chosen for its symbolic significance rather than any supernatural beliefs, took place the secret wedding. In the basement of their manor was held the ceremony, witnessed only by the corrupt minister and 2 servants who had been threatened into silence. A mockery of Christian tradition was the wedding itself, performed not in celebration of love or spiritual union, but as a legal maneuver designed to protect their accumulated wealth and shared secrets. In early 1676, the pregnancy that began seemed to validate the siblings' confidence in their unholy arrangement. Normally through the first several months progressed Judith's condition, with no signs of complications or abnormalities. From Boston, a skilled midwife was hired by the siblings, paying her an extraordinary fee to relocate temporarily to their manor and provide the best possible care. Special foods, imported medicines were ordered by them, and even matching cradles commissioned, crafted from the finest mahogany and fitted with silk bedding suitable for children destined to inherit great wealth. But as Judith's pregnancy advanced into its final trimester, subtle signs began to emerge that something was terribly wrong. During the 7th month came the first indication, when movements that the midwife described as unusual in their violence and coordination began to be experienced by Judith. Sarah Whiteham, the experienced midwife who had delivered more than 300 babies throughout her career, had never felt fetal movements quite like those occurring within Judith's womb. Rather than the typical patterns of kicks and turns that characterize normal development, these movements seemed to involve multiple entities engaged in what could only be described as combat. "It's as though they're fighting each other," Sarah confided to her assistant, a young woman named Emma Prescott, who had come from Boston to help with what was expected to be a routine, if secretive, delivery. "I've delivered twins before many times, but never have I felt such aggressive motion. It's almost as if they're trying to harm one another." As the superstitious imaginings of an old woman were these concerns dismissed by Ezekiel, but privately he began to worry. Too much in this pregnancy had been invested by the siblings to accept that anything might go wrong, and research designed to explain and address whatever complications might arise was thrown into by Ezekiel. Every medical text available in the colonies was purchased by him, correspondence was made with physicians in London and Edinburgh, and even consultation with several midwives from other regions was done to gather information about difficult births and abnormal developments. Both reassuring and deeply disturbing was what he discovered in his research. That twin pregnancies often involved more violent fetal movements than single births was confirmed by multiple texts, particularly when the children were competing for limited space and resources within the womb. But increased risks associated with what they termed close kinship between parents were also mentioned by several sources, including higher rates of stillbirth, physical abnormalities, and mental deficiencies in surviving offspring. For nearly 2 days lasted the birth, when it finally began on March 15, 1677, and involved complications that would haunt Sarah Whiteham for the remainder of her life. Immediately recognizable as severely malformed were the twins that emerged, with limbs that branched at impossible angles, skulls that seemed to have developed additional bony protrusions, and bodies that appeared to be connected by tissue bridges that linked their torsos and possibly internal organs. That these children possessed an awareness and coordination that seemed far beyond their apparent developmental stage was what truly shocked the attending women. With purpose they moved, objects placed near them were grasped, and through a series of sounds and gestures that neither midwife could interpret, communication with each other seemed to be made by them. Despite their severe physical abnormalities, intelligence that was both remarkable and deeply unsettling was demonstrated by the twins. The children, whom Ezekiel and Judith named Gabriel and Raphael, choosing biblical names that might provide some protection against supernatural interpretation of their condition, survived their difficult birth and began to grow in ways that defied every expectation about children born with such severe deformities. By their first birthday, that their intelligence far exceeded normal developmental milestones was clear, even as their physical limitations became more pronounced. Both the height of the Harrington siblings' power and the beginning of their greatest challenge were marked by the years between 1677 and 1685. As Gabriel and Raphael grew from infants into children, problems that went far beyond simple medical care were created by their unique combination of severe physical deformities and extraordinary intelligence. The boys, for they were indeed male twins, despite their unusual shared anatomy, required constant supervision and specialized attention that made maintaining the siblings' public careers increasingly difficult. By the time the twins reached their 8th birthday in March of 1685, into something unprecedented in colonial Massachusetts had they developed. Severely disabled children who possessed intellectual capabilities that rivaled those of educated adults were what they had become. Despite their inability to walk normally or engage in typical childhood activities, by age 4 had taught themselves to read. Gabriel and Raphael had mastered basic mathematics by age 5, and by their 7th year were engaging in philosophical discussions that would have challenged university students. But perhaps most disturbing of all was their growing awareness of their parents' true nature and activities. Within the manor for their entire lives had the twins been kept isolated, officially to protect them from cruel stares and supernatural fears, but actually to prevent anyone from witnessing their condition and connecting it to divine judgment upon their parents' crimes. This isolation, however, had given them unprecedented access to their parents' private conversations, business records, and planning sessions for their various criminal enterprises. An uncanny ability to remain silent and motionless when adults entered their vicinity had been developed by Gabriel and Raphael, leading Ezekiel and Judith to discuss sensitive matters freely in their presence, assuming the children were too young or too disabled to understand what they were hearing. A catastrophic mistake that would ultimately lead to the siblings' destruction proved to be this assumption. By 1685, detailed knowledge of their parents' witch-hunting operations was possessed by the twins, including specific information about manufactured evidence, bribed witnesses, and the systematic murder of innocent people for financial gain. More significantly, that their own physical condition was not the result of divine judgment or random misfortune, but rather the direct consequence of their parents' decision to marry within their bloodline to protect their criminal empire had they begun to understand. A mixture of rage, grief, and determination that was remarkable in its intensity and sophistication had this understanding filled the children with. Despite their physical limitations and their complete dependence on their parents for basic care, ways to expose the truth about the Harrington criminal enterprise and secure justice for their parents' victims had begun to be planned by Gabriel and Raphael. In the summer of 1685 came the twins' first opportunity to act on their knowledge, when a young woman named Margaret Caldwell arrived at the manor seeking employment as a servant. The daughter of one of Ezekiel and Judith's earlier victims was Margaret, a blacksmith named Thomas Caldwell, who had been executed for witchcraft in 1679 after the siblings had orchestrated his accusation to acquire his valuable forge and prime real estate in the center of Hadley's Crossing. That the Harrington siblings were responsible for her father's death had Margaret no idea. She knew only that they were wealthy, respected members of the community who might provide employment for a young woman left destitute by family tragedy. What she discovered during her residence at the manor, however, was evidence that would eventually lead to the most significant witch trial scandal in colonial American history. Both ingenious and heartbreaking was the twins' strategy for communicating with Margaret. Despite their severe speech impediments and physical limitations, ways of leaving written messages and locations where she would find them during her cleaning duties had been developed by them. Simply with basic information about hidden documents and suspicious financial records began these messages, but gradually expanded to include detailed instructions about where to find evidence of their parents' crimes. More importantly, to distinguish between their parents' different visitors had been learned by Gabriel and Raphael, and ways of warning Margaret when particularly dangerous individuals were scheduled to arrive at the manor had been developed by them. Enough of their parents' operations had they observed to understand that some of their associates were even more violent and unpredictable than Ezekiel and Judith themselves, and their advanced knowledge of appointments and meetings was used by them to help Margaret avoid potentially fatal encounters. In September 1685 came the turning point, when specific information about where their parents kept their most incriminating records was provided to Margaret by the twins. A hidden compartment behind a false wall in Ezekiel's study that contained detailed financial ledgers documenting 15 years of criminal activity. Not only records of payments received for each witch trial were included in these ledgers, but also itemized lists of confiscated properties, their estimated values, and notations about preparation costs and witness fees that revealed the systematic nature of their operations. Irrefutable proof that the Harrington siblings had been murdering innocent people for money was provided to Margaret by her discovery of these records, but it also placed her in mortal danger. That if Ezekiel and Judith discovered her knowledge, they would not hesitate to eliminate her using the same methods they had perfected against their other victims was understood by her. On finding a way to expose their crimes while protecting herself and the twins from retaliation lay her only hope. Both courage and strategic thinking that would have impressed even experienced criminal investigators was demonstrated by the solution she ultimately chose. Rather than attempting to flee with the evidence or confront the siblings directly, secretly copying the most damning documents was begun by Margaret while simultaneously establishing contact with Father Benedict Thorne, a Jesuit priest who had recently arrived in Boston from France and who possessed both the theological knowledge to understand supernatural implications and the political connections to investigate powerful colonial figures. With skepticism began Father Benedict Thorne's investigation into the Harrington siblings, but quickly evolved into horror as layer after layer of systematic evil that had operated virtually unchecked for more than 2 decades was uncovered by him. Cautious and indirect had been Margaret Caldwell's initial approach to the priest, as she understood that direct accusations against such powerful and respected figures would likely result in her own destruction through the same methods they had used against their other victims. But a picture of criminal enterprise that exceeded even the priest's worst expectations about human capacity for evil was painted by the evidence that Margaret gradually shared with Father Thorne, copies of financial ledgers, witness lists with notations about payments and threats, and most damning of all, detailed maps marking the locations of confiscated properties and their current ownership. Uniquely qualified to understand the full implications of what Margaret had discovered was Father Thorne's expertise in both theology and natural philosophy. Unlike colonial authorities who might dismiss supernatural accusations as beyond their jurisdiction, or medical professionals who might focus solely on the children's physical condition, the knowledge and authority to investigate both the criminal and moral dimensions of the Harrington case was possessed by the priest. As a routine pastoral call was presented his decision to visit the manor in October 1685 to the siblings, the new priest seeking to introduce himself to prominent members of the colonial community and offer spiritual guidance to a family that had suffered the tragedy of difficult births. As an opportunity to further legitimize their standing in the community while gathering intelligence about potential threats to their operations was welcomed the visit by Ezekiel and Judith, confident in their ability to manipulate religious authorities. Father Thorne's specific training in recognizing deception and his expertise in identifying the psychological and spiritual consequences of systematic evil was what they failed to anticipate. Within minutes of entering the manor, atmospheric disturbances that suggested the presence of profound spiritual corruption were detected by the priest, not supernatural intervention, but rather the psychological residue left by decades of calculated murder and moral degradation. By pastoral concern for young souls dealing with physical challenges was ostensibly motivated the priest's request to meet the children. But to assess whether Gabriel and Raphael possessed the intelligence and awareness necessary to serve as witnesses against their parents was his true purpose. That the twins understood far more about their situation than their parents realized had been suggested by Margaret's written reports, but their capabilities firsthand needed to be evaluated by Father Thorn before risking their safety by involving them in his investigation. What he encountered there when Father Thorn finally gained access to the children's chambers exceeded even Margaret's detailed descriptions in its combination of tragedy and possibility. Intellectual sophistication and emotional maturity that was remarkable for children of any age, particularly those who had been isolated from normal social interaction for their entire lives, was demonstrated by Gabriel and Raphael, despite their severe physical limitations and obvious daily pain. More significantly, no fear of the priest was shown by the twins despite never having seen him before, and instead what could only be described as relief and hope was displayed by them. Clearly, for someone with the authority and courage to challenge their parents had they been waiting, and immediately attempting to communicate information about crimes they had witnessed and evidence they had observed being hidden or destroyed was begun by them. Instruction in ministering to victims of extreme cruelty had been included in Father Thorn's theological training, and in these children he recognized the same combination of suffering, awareness, and desperate hope that he had observed in survivors of torture and persecution. But unlike those previous cases where the victims had been adults capable of explaining their situations and seeking justice, by their physical limitations and their complete dependence on the very people who were responsible for both their condition and their suffering were trapped Gabriel and Raphael. Superficially cordial was the priest's departure from the manor, but that a fundamental confrontation had begun was understood by all parties. Enough to confirm his worst suspicions about the children's situation and their parents' character had been seen by Father Thorn, while in his manner and questions a level of perception and determination that posed unprecedented danger to their carefully constructed lives had been recognized by Ezekiel and Judith. Methodical, comprehensive, and conducted with the full resources of the Catholic Church's administrative and intelligence networks was the investigation that Father Thorn launched upon returning to Boston. Unlike the crude legal systems of the individual colonies, sophisticated methods for gathering evidence, analyzing testimony, and building cases against powerful individuals who believed themselves above earthly justice were possessed by the Church. Within 3 weeks, a complete dossier on the Harrington siblings' activities had been assembled by Father Thorn, including financial records subpoenaed from colonial banks, testimonies from surviving relatives of their victims, and most damning of all, a detailed confession from Marcus Fletcher, a former accomplice who had helped plant evidence and coach witnesses for several witch trials in exchange for payment and protection from his own legal troubles. The true scope of the Harrington criminal enterprise, including details about their methods for selecting victims, creating false evidence, and coordinating with corrupt officials to ensure favorable legal outcomes, was revealed by Marcus Fletcher's confession. But more importantly for Father Thorn's purposes, specific information about the siblings' decision to marry each other and their explicit discussions about using their children's condition to further expand their wealth through private exhibitions to wealthy individuals curious about medical anomalies was included in Fletcher's testimony. An additional layer of horror to an already overwhelming case was added by this revelation. Not only had Ezekiel and Judith condemned innocent people to death for financial gain, but children into the world through an incestuous union specifically designed to protect their criminal empire had also been brought by them, and for additional profit were now planning to exploit their offspring's suffering. But the children themselves proved to be Father Thorn's most powerful weapon in his campaign against the Harrington siblings. Detailed memories of conversations and events that provided crucial corroboration for the evidence found in their parents' records were possessed by Gabriel and Raphael, despite their youth and physical limitations. More importantly, compelling witnesses whose testimony could not be dismissed as the fantasies of damaged minds were made them by their obvious intelligence and moral awareness. A level of systematic abuse and exploitation that went far beyond simple neglect was revealed by the priest's careful interviews with the twins, conducted during secret visits arranged by Margaret Caldwell. Not only had Ezekiel and Judith hidden their children from the world to protect their own reputations, but psychological experiments designed to test the limits of human endurance and adaptability had also been conducted by them using the twins' isolation and dependence. Years of being subjected to painful medical procedures without anesthesia, being forced to perform intellectual tasks under threat of withdrawn food or comfort, and being used as subjects for their parents' theories about the relationship between physical deformity and mental capacity were described by Gabriel and Raphael. Most horrifying of all, that their parents had been systematically documenting their development and behavior with the intention of selling detailed reports to European physicians interested in the effects of consanguinity on human offspring was revealed by them. Escalating tension to the Harrington Manor was brought by the final months of 1685 as multiple forces converged to threaten the siblings' carefully constructed empire of blood and deception. The point where irrefutable evidence of their crimes was possessed by Father Thorn had been reached by his investigation, but the delicate challenge of exposing such powerful and dangerous individuals without triggering a violent response that might endanger the children and other potential witnesses was faced by him. Meanwhile, increasingly bold in their efforts to assist in their parents' downfall had grown Gabriel and Raphael. Using their privileged position as isolated invalids to observe and document activities that even Margaret Caldwell could not safely witness, sophisticated methods for recording information despite their physical limitations had been developed by the twins, creating hidden caches of written evidence that detailed their parents' ongoing criminal activities and future plans. By their parents had not gone unnoticed the children's growing defiance, who had begun to suspect that more awareness and capability than they had previously realized was possessed by their offspring. The complete absence of natural parental affection that had characterized their relationship with the twins from birth was revealed by Ezekiel and Judith's response to this suspicion. Rather than feeling pride in their children's intelligence or concern for their well-being, a potential threat to their security was how the siblings viewed Gabriel and Raphael's developing autonomy. In early December 1685 began the crisis that would ultimately bring the entire criminal enterprise crashing down, when evidence that someone had been accessing his hidden financial records was discovered by Ezekiel. Scratch marks on the false walls, concealed hinges and displaced dust patterns on the documents suggested repeated unauthorized entry to his most sensitive files. More disturbing still was the realization that sufficient knowledge to identify the most incriminating materials was possessed by whoever had gained access. Pages containing direct references to bribery, witness intimidation, and property fraud had been subtly marked with tiny pencil dots that would be invisible to casual inspection, but clearly indicated systematic study. Upon Margaret Caldwell fell Ezekiel's immediate suspicion, whose position as household servant provided her with both opportunity and motivation to spy on her employers. But when brutal interrogation using techniques they had perfected during their witch-hunting career was subjected to Margaret by him and Judith, they discovered that while she indeed possessed knowledge of their crimes, for all of the security breaches they had detected she could not possibly have been responsible. So far outside their psychological framework was the truth that their own children had been systematically gathering evidence against them for months that initially considered the possibility by neither sibling. So accustomed to viewing Gabriel and Raphael as helpless dependents whose physical limitations rendered them essentially harmless had they become that as active threats to their security they could not conceive of the twins. A fatal miscalculation that would ultimately cost them everything they had worked to build proved to be this blindness to their children's capabilities. While on external threats like Margaret Caldwell and Father Thorn focused their suspicions, Ezekiel and Judith, with increasing sophistication and boldness, continued their intelligence-gathering activities. Gabriel and Raphael. Communication methods that allowed them to coordinate their efforts despite being physically separated during most daily activities had been developed by the twins. A combination of written messages, coded sounds, and even manipulation of household objects was used by them to share information and plan their next moves. Their physical limitations, which as guarantees of helplessness had been viewed by their parents, had actually forced them to develop intellectual and observational skills that far exceeded those of normal children their age. By mid-December 1685, evidence that included not only documentation of their parents' past crimes but also detailed intelligence about planned future operations had been compiled by Gabriel and Raphael. That Ezekiel and Judith were preparing to expand their activities into the Connecticut River Valley, where community tensions that could be exploited for profit through accusations of supernatural collaboration with hostile forces had been created by recent Indian raids, had been learned by them. More immediately threatening was the twins' discovery that their elimination as potential witnesses and security risks had begun to be planned by their parents. Discussions about tragic accidents that might befall disabled children during the harsh winter months had been overheard by Gabriel and Raphael, and preparations that suggested an intention to dispose of them before spring arrived had been observed by them being made by their parents. Both their remarkable intelligence and their profound understanding of their parents' psychology was demonstrated by the children's response to this threat. Rather than attempting to flee or simply warning Father Thorn about their immediate danger, accelerating their evidence-gathering activities was chosen by Gabriel and Raphael while simultaneously laying the groundwork for a final confrontation that would expose the full scope of their parents' evil. Elegant and terrible in its sophistication was their plan. Their parents' own methods would be used against them by them, orchestrating a scenario that would force Ezekiel and Judith to reveal their true nature in the presence of witnesses who possessed the authority and credibility to ensure justice. That their physical condition made them unlikely to survive any direct conflict with their parents was understood by the twins, but they were willing to sacrifice themselves if the exposure of crimes that had claimed dozens of innocent lives could be guaranteed by their deaths. On December 21, 1685, came the opportunity they had been waiting for. The 10th anniversary of their parents' secret wedding, and a date that with private celebrations revealing their true personalities more clearly than any other occasion was always marked by Ezekiel and Judith. The perfect setting for their final gambit was provided to Gabriel and Raphael by this annual ritual, which as a commemoration of their successful partnership in evil was viewed by the siblings. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, intensifies the horror in the Harrington manner. If this story is giving you chills, with a friend who loves dark mysteries, share this video. To support our content, hit that like button, and to never miss stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. Let's discover together what happens next. Precise timing, complete commitment, and a level of courage that would have been remarkable in adults, let alone children who had never known life outside the walls of their prison home, was required by the twins' plan. But something their parents had never expected was possessed by them, understood Gabriel and Raphael, the moral clarity that comes from suffering injustice and the intellectual capacity to transform that clarity into effective action. With a precision that reflected months of careful planning by two 8-year-old children who had never experienced normal childhood, but had instead been forced to develop the strategic thinking of seasoned investigators, unfolded the events of December 21, 1685. On their intimate knowledge of their parents' habits, personalities, and criminal methods, combined with their unique position as witnesses whom Ezekiel and Judith consistently underestimated, depended Gabriel and Raphael's plan. For Father Thorn to arrive at the manor during the evening hours when their parents traditionally conducted their anniversary celebration, a private ritual that involved reviewing their accumulated wealth, reading selected passages from their victim lists, and planning future operations, had been arranged by the twins. This celebration, which as completely secret was believed by the siblings, actually took place in a room directly above the children's chambers, and for years had been listened to these annual recitations of evil by Gabriel and Raphael. Thick with an almost palpable sense of malevolence was the atmosphere in the manor that December evening as Ezekiel and Judith prepared for their 10th anniversary celebration. The day reviewing their financial records and preparing materials for what they planned to be their final winter in Massachusetts before relocating their operations to the more profitable and less scrutinized territories of the Carolina colonies had been spent by the siblings. Some of their New England properties had already been begun liquidating by them, and new identities that would allow them to continue their criminal enterprise in regions where their reputations had not yet preceded them were being prepared to be established by them. As always during their parents' private meetings confined to their chambers, Gabriel and Raphael had spent weeks preparing for this night with the methodical precision of experienced conspirators. Despite their physical limitations, multiple hidden caches of evidence throughout the manor had been managed to be created by them, including copies of their parents' most incriminating documents, detailed maps of confiscated properties, and written testimonies describing specific crimes they had witnessed or overheard being planned. More significantly, specific structural elements of the manor's construction had been spent months weakening by the twins using tools they had fashioned from household items and techniques they had learned by studying architectural texts from their parents' extensive library. Not only perfect timing but also an understanding of physics and engineering that would have challenged adult builders was required by their plan. Yet through pure necessity and their desperate determination to escape their prison had these concepts been mastered by them. By a careful reconnaissance that he had conducted over several weeks, during which he had mapped the building's layout, identified potential escape routes, and established communication protocols with Gabriel and Raphael through a system of light signals visible from their chamber windows, was preceded Father Thorn's arrival at the manor. Invaluable in planning what was essentially a rescue operation disguised as a pastoral visit proved to be the priest's military background. He had served as a chaplain during European conflicts before joining the church, which had provided him with tactical knowledge. Not only colonial officials with arrest warrants but also physicians prepared to examine and treat the Harrington children, legal clerks ready to catalog evidence, and even a skilled engineer whose expertise would be needed to safely extract victims from what promised to be a dangerous confrontation were included in the authorities who accompanied Father Thorn. The priest's understanding that they would have only one opportunity to expose the Harrington crimes before the siblings either fled or eliminated all witnesses to their activities was reflected by this level of preparation. At precisely 7 o'clock that evening, when Father Thorn knocked on the manor's front door, in the middle of their anniversary ritual, surrounded by evidence that would have made denial impossible, even if they had been inclined toward honesty, were Ezekiel and Judith. Of annoyed confidence was the siblings' initial response to the unexpected visit. For more than 20 years had they successfully deflected official inquiries and saw no reason why different should prove this occasion. But as his ostensible purpose, concern for Margaret Caldwell's welfare and a desire to offer spiritual guidance to the family during the difficult winter season, was explained by Father Thorn, that something was fundamentally different about this visitor began to be sensed by both Ezekiel and Judith. Too assured was the priest's manner, his questions too specific, and his knowledge of their household arrangements too detailed for a casual pastoral call. When permission to visit Gabriel and Raphael was requested by Father Thorn, ostensibly to offer prayers for their continued health and comfort, came the moment of truth. To refuse this request with their usual explanations about the children's fragile condition and susceptibility to excitement was the siblings' immediate instinct, but that such refusal might itself seem suspicious to someone who was clearly paying closer attention than previous visitors was realized by them. The fatal mistake that would destroy everything they had built over 2 decades of systematic murder and theft proved to be their decision to grant Father Thorn access to the children's chambers. When the priest entered the twins' room, followed by Ezekiel and Judith, who wanted to monitor the conversation, immediately implemented was the signal system that he and the children had previously arranged. Immediate and devastating was Gabriel and Raphael's response. Despite their parents' presence, a detailed account of specific crimes they had witnessed, complete with dates, victim names, and descriptions of evidence locations, began reciting by the twins. Their voices, though distorted by their physical condition, an authority and precision that made their testimony undeniably credible carried. On the night of September 14 in the year 1679, began Gabriel, his words carefully enunciated despite the effort required. Our father and mother met with Marcus Fletcher in the cellar to plan the accusation of Thomas Caldwell. Mother provided Fletcher with silver coins taken from Rebecca Whitmore's confiscated jewelry, and father gave him detailed instructions about where to hide the puppet that would be discovered during Caldwell's barn search. Without pause continued the recitation by Raphael, demonstrating the coordinated preparation that had made their testimony so devastating. The puppet contained hair taken from Caldwell's youngest daughter during a forced medical examination our parents conducted under pretense of checking for supernatural marks. Fletcher was instructed to place the puppet beneath the anvil in Caldwell's forge, where it would be discovered by witnesses who had been told exactly where to look. Devastating to Ezekiel and Judith's composure was the psychological impact of hearing their most carefully guarded secrets recited by their own children in the presence of a priest who clearly possessed the authority to act on such testimony. For the first time in their criminal careers, completely unprepared for a threat they had never anticipated found themselves betrayal by victims they had assumed were helpless and ignorant. But far from finished with their revelations were the twins. Not only their parents' past crimes but also their current activities and future plans had been spent years memorizing by Gabriel and Raphael. Hidden caches of stolen property were described by them, detailed the bribery networks that had protected their parents from investigation, and most damaging of all, the existence of additional victims whose deaths had been concealed so successfully that authorities had never suspected murder was revealed by them. In the chest beneath the floorboards of the study's eastern corner, continued Raphael, his voice growing stronger as he realized that rescue was finally at hand, there are 37 pieces of jewelry taken from executed women, including the wedding ring of Mary Hutchkins, who was hanged for witchcraft in 1681 after father accused her of cursing his livestock. Seamlessly picked up the narrative by Gabriel. Mary Hutchkins was innocent of all charges. Father killed her cow using poison he purchased from a merchant in Boston, then claimed the animal's death was proof of supernatural interference. Mary's property, including 12 acres of prime farmland and her late husband's blacksmith tools, was divided between the town treasury and our parents as payment for identifying the supposed witch. An overwhelming case that no rational observer could dismiss or explain away was created by the detailed accuracy of the children's testimony, combined with their obvious intelligence and the physical evidence of their terrible condition. Not only the legal authority to investigate the Harrington crimes but also witnesses whose credibility could not be questioned, and documentation methods that would preserve every word of the twins' revelations had been brought with him by Father Thorne. The complete absence of natural human emotions that had characterized their entire criminal enterprise was revealed by Ezekiel and Judith's response to this devastating exposure. Rather than showing shock, remorse, or even fear for their children's welfare, how to eliminate the witnesses and escape the consequences of their crimes immediately began to be calculated by the siblings. By claiming that the children suffered from delusions caused by their physical condition involved their first attempt at damage control, trying to discredit Gabriel and Raphael's testimony. But when copies of documents that corroborated every detail the twins had provided along with testimony from other witnesses who had independently confirmed specific elements of their account were produced by Father Thorne, collapsed this strategy. That denial was impossible and that their criminal enterprise was about to be completely exposed was realized by them. The emergency plan they had developed for exactly this scenario was implemented by Ezekiel and Judith. Throughout the manor were hidden weapons, escape routes, and contingency funds that would allow them to eliminate all witnesses and flee to territories where colonial authority could not reach them. Swift and brutal was the violence that followed, but exactly as Gabriel and Raphael had anticipated and planned it unfolded. Their parents' emergency procedures had been spent months studying by the twins, and countermeasures designed to protect their rescuers while ensuring that Ezekiel and Judith could not escape justice had been developed by them. When a concealed pistol was drawn by Ezekiel and an attempt to shoot Father Thorne was made by him, that the weapon's firing mechanism had been subtly sabotaged by small metal fragments that Gabriel had painstakingly inserted into the barrel over many weeks was discovered by him. In his hand exploded the gun, causing severe injuries that left him unable to continue fighting. When one of several floor traps that Raphael had prepared by loosening specific floorboards in strategic locations was triggered by Judith, her attempt to use a hidden knife against the colonial officials was thwarted. Not only incapacitated her fall, but also a series of mechanical devices that the twins had constructed to barricade doors and windows, preventing any possibility of escape, were activated by it. In the manor's main hall took place the final confrontation, where the structural modifications that Gabriel and Raphael had made over many months finally achieved their intended purpose. The precise amount of damage needed to make specific portions of the building unstable while leaving safe passages for their intended rescuers had been calculated by the twins. That their escape routes had been blocked and their weapons rendered useless was realized by Ezekiel and Judith. One final desperate attempt to silence their children permanently was made by them. But this response had been anticipated by Gabriel and Raphael, and their ultimate defense had been prepared by them. A coordinated collapse of the manor's central support structure that would trap their parents while creating protective shelter around themselves and their rescuers. Remarkably accurate proved to be the twins' engineering calculations. Exactly as they had planned occurred the building's collapse, creating a debris field that pinned Ezekiel and Judith beneath massive wooden beams while leaving Gabriel, Raphael, Father Thorne, and the colonial officials in a protected alcove that remained structurally sound. Beyond simply stopping the siblings' escape attempt served multiple purposes: the physical destruction of the manor. Hidden rooms and concealed storage areas that contained additional evidence of their crimes, including preserved documents, stolen property, and even the remains of victims whose deaths had never been officially recorded, were exposed by the collapse. Most significantly, a symbolic end to their captivity and the beginning of their liberation was represented by the destruction of the building that had served as both prison and torture chamber for Gabriel and Raphael. The walls that had confined them for 8 years had literally been brought down by the twins, using their intelligence and determination to transform their physical limitations into strategic advantages. When finally enough debris to reach the survivors was cleared by rescue workers, a scene that perfectly illustrated the moral dimensions of the Harrington case was found by them. Beneath the rubble lay dead Ezekiel and Judith, their faces showing the shock and disbelief of criminals who had never imagined that their own children could orchestrate their downfall. Though injured and exhausted, very much alive and eager to continue providing testimony that would expose the full scope of their parents' criminal enterprise were Gabriel and Raphael. Crucial in the legal proceedings that would prove to be was the twins' survival and their obvious intelligence, making them compelling witnesses. But more importantly, that physical limitations need not constrain moral agency or the pursuit of justice was demonstrated by their courage in exposing their parents' crimes despite the enormous personal risk. Throughout colonial Massachusetts sent shockwaves the aftermath of the Harrington Manor's collapse that would influence legal procedures, religious practices, and community vigilance for generations to come. Irrefutable proof of systematic judicial murder that forced colonial authorities to confront the terrifying possibility that other witch trials might have been similarly corrupted by greed and manipulation was provided by the detailed evidence recovered from the ruins, combined with Gabriel and Raphael's comprehensive testimony. Unprecedented in their scope and severity were the immediate legal consequences. Within days of the manor's destruction, posthumous convictions against Ezekiel and Judith Harrington on 57 counts of murder along with numerous additional charges related to fraud, bribery, judicial corruption, and conspiracy had been issued by colonial courts. So overwhelming was the evidence and so extensive the crime that as the most comprehensive criminal prosecution in colonial American history would later be cited the Harrington case by legal scholars. But far beyond the posthumous punishment of 2 dead criminals extended the legal ramifications. The systematic nature of the Harrington crimes combined with evidence of their connections to corrupt officials throughout the colonial legal system triggered a comprehensive review of witch trial procedures that revealed disturbing patterns of abuse and manipulation in communities across New England. Not only the Harrington crimes but also evidence that similar schemes had operated in other colonies had been uncovered by Father Benedict Thorne's investigation, suggesting that the abuse of supernatural accusations for financial gain was far more widespread than authorities had previously suspected. To growing skepticism about witch trials contributed this revelation and helped accelerate the legal reforms that would eventually end the period of supernatural persecution in colonial America. Over the course of 3 years was systematically dismantled the financial empire built on blood money, requiring the creation of special legal procedures to handle the complexity of unwinding decades of fraudulent property acquisitions. As having been obtained through criminal means were identified properties worth more than £25,000, and the unprecedented challenge of restoring stolen assets to the families of victims who had been murdered decades earlier was faced by colonial courts. The true scope of the Harrington operations and additional evidence of their systematic approach to crime was revealed by the process of financial restitution. From the manor's ruins recovered detailed records showed that meticulous documentation of their activities had been maintained by the siblings, including maps of confiscated properties, lists of bribed officials, and even financial projections for future criminal enterprises they had planned to establish in other colonies. Far more resilient than anyone had expected proved to be Gabriel and Raphael Harrington, despite the horrific circumstances of their birth and childhood. Under the careful supervision of Dr. William Harvey, a royal physician brought from London specifically to study their condition, not only survived their ordeal but began to thrive in ways that challenged contemporary understanding of human development and adaptation. Did they? That their physical condition, while severe, was not as limiting as their parents had claimed was revealed by Dr. Harvey's initial examination of the twins. Through deliberate neglect and psychological manipulation designed to keep them dependent and controllable had been artificially imposed much of their apparent helplessness. Remarkable improvement in their mobility and overall health was demonstrated by Gabriel and Raphael with proper medical care, nutrition, and physical therapy. More significantly, their intellectual capabilities, which from early childhood had been evident, flourished when proper education and social interaction were finally provided to them. Within months of their rescue, at levels that exceeded most adults were reading the twins, mathematical abilities that impressed university scholars were demonstrated by them, and artistic talents that drew attention from intellectuals throughout the colonies were shown by them. Foundational texts in the emerging field of medical psychology became Dr. Harvey's detailed documentation of their progress, demonstrating that by physical appearance or condition was not determined intellectual capacity. That proper care and education could unlock extraordinary potential even in the most challenging circumstances was shown by his reports, challenging prevailing assumptions about disability and intelligence. In the legal proceedings that followed their rescue continued to be crucial. The twins' testimony, corroboration for documentary evidence, and helped prosecutors build cases against dozens of surviving accomplices who had aided the Harrington crimes over the years was provided by their detailed memories of their parents' conversations and activities. But perhaps more importantly, compelling witnesses whose accounts could not be dismissed as fantasies or fabrications were made them by their obvious intelligence and moral clarity. No signs of the mental damage that might have been expected from their traumatic early experiences were revealed by the psychological evaluation of Gabriel and Raphael conducted by Dr. Harvey and his colleagues. Despite years of isolation, abuse, and psychological manipulation, remarkable emotional stability and moral development that suggested an innate resilience that had protected them from the worst effects of their ordeal was demonstrated by the twins. As Gabriel and Raphael adapted to life outside their prison home and began to interact with the wider colonial community proved crucial. This resilience of curiosity and sometimes fear were made them objects by their physical condition, but the respect of those who took the time to know them as individuals rather than simply as medical anomalies was quickly won by their intelligence and dignity. A powerful argument for the inclusion and education of individuals with physical differences became the transformation of public perception regarding the twins. That human potential could not be judged by physical appearance and that society benefited when all individuals were given opportunities to contribute their talents and insights was provided as evidence by Gabriel and Raphael's success in overcoming their circumstances. As remarkable as their childhood ordeal had been, traumatic proved to be their adult lives. A respected legal scholar whose writings on evidence, witness protection, and judicial corruption influenced colonial jurisprudence for decades developed into Gabriel. Despite his physical limitations, a sought-after consultant for complex criminal cases became he and helped establish the first formal procedures for protecting child witnesses in legal proceedings. By his childhood experiences and his understanding of how vulnerable individuals could be exploited by those in positions of authority were directly informed Gabriel's legal innovations. The development of special courts designed to handle cases involving child witnesses, enhanced protections for individuals with disabilities involved in legal proceedings, and improved methods for gathering and preserving testimony from vulnerable populations was led to by his work. Into becoming a physician channeled his experiences Raphael, specializing in the care of children with physical abnormalities and victims of abuse. In its emphasis on treating patients as complete human beings rather than simply collections of symptoms was revolutionary. His medical practice, and his therapeutic method stressed dignity, education, and social integration rather than isolation and shame. Throughout the medical community became known as Dr. Raphael Harrington, and the first school in colonial America specifically designed to educate children with disabilities was established by him. That physical limitations need not constrain intellectual achievement and that proper support and education could enable individuals with various conditions to contribute meaningfully to society was demonstrated by his institution. Prevailing attitudes about disability and education throughout the colonies were challenged by the school's success, inspiring the establishment of similar institutions and contributing to broader social changes in how communities treated their most vulnerable members. The potential within every individual and the responsibility of society to provide opportunities for that potential to be realized was emphasized by Raphael's educational philosophy. Families of their own were established by both twins, and they married. Their children showing no trace of their grandparents' moral corruption or their parents' physical challenges. Non-hereditary proved to be the genetic abnormalities that had resulted from Ezekiel and Judith's incestuous union, allowing Gabriel and Raphael to break the cycle of suffering that had defined their early years. Particularly significant given their traumatic childhood experiences was the twins' success in creating loving, stable families. That even the most severe early trauma need not determine the course of an entire life when proper support and intervention are provided was demonstrated by their ability to form healthy relationships and raise well-adjusted children. For understanding family dynamics, child development, and the long-term effects of abuse had profound implications. The Harrington case. That resilience and healing were possible even in the most extreme circumstances, provided that victims received appropriate care and support, became powerful evidence by Gabriel and Raphael's recovery and subsequent achievements. On religious and legal institutions throughout colonial America also had lasting effects. The investigation led by Father Thorne, a model for future investigations and helped establish protocols that would influence law enforcement for generations, became the priest's methodology for gathering evidence, protecting witnesses, and building cases against powerful criminals. Required reading for legal scholars and religious authorities became Father Thorne's detailed documentation of the Harrington case, demonstrating how systematic evil could flourish when communities failed to maintain proper oversight of their institutions and leaders. Reforms in both civil and religious governance that strengthened protections against abuse of authority were contributed to by his work. By colonial authorities was designated the physical site of the Harrington Manor as a memorial ground. As a reminder of how easily justice can be corrupted when communities allow fear and superstition to override critical thinking and moral courage were left undisturbed its ruins. An educational site where visitors could learn about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of protecting vulnerable community members was served by the memorial, maintained by funds established through the sale of confiscated Harrington properties. Not only the date of the siblings' deaths but also an inscription commissioned by Gabriel and Raphael is borne by the simple stone marker that still stands today. Here lies the evidence that evil is not supernatural. It is a human choice that can be made by ordinary people who value comfort over conscience. Let all who pass remember that justice depends on the courage of those who refuse to remain silent when confronted with wrongdoing. Perhaps most significantly, that children, regardless of their physical condition or social status, possess inherent dignity and moral agency that must be respected and protected was demonstrated by the Harrington case. Contemporary assumptions about childhood disability and moral responsibility were challenged by Gabriel and Raphael's courage in exposing their parents' crimes despite their complete dependence on those same parents for survival. A powerful argument for children's rights and protections that would influence legal and social developments throughout American history became their story. Evolving concepts of childhood that emphasize protection, education, and respect for individual dignity were contributed to by the recognition that children could be both victims of abuse and agents of their own liberation. Beyond their immediate historical context to influence broader discussions about disability rights, victim advocacy, and the prevention of systematic abuse extended the twins' legacy. Prejudices that had persisted for centuries were challenged by their demonstration that physical limitations need not constrain intellectual or moral development, and more inclusive concepts of human potential and social responsibility were contributed to by them. In contemporary discussions about child protection, disability rights, and the prevention of institutional abuse continues to resonate the Harrington case. That individuals have the capacity for remarkable resilience and moral insight when given the tools and support they need to overcome adversity regardless of their physical condition or traumatic experiences is demonstrated by Gabriel and Raphael's story. Enduring evidence that human dignity cannot be destroyed by abuse or neglect and that society has both the opportunity and the obligation to support all individuals in realizing their potential for contribution and achievement is served by their ultimate triumph over seemingly impossible circumstances. How communities can become complicit in evil when fear and superstition override critical thinking and moral courage is shown to us by this mystery. For nearly 2 decades succeeded the Harrington siblings, not because they were supernatural monsters, but because they understood how to exploit human weaknesses and turn neighbors against each other for profit. From the determination of brave individuals who refused to remain silent in the face of injustice came their ultimate defeat, not from divine intervention. What do you think of this story? Do you believe there might have been other witch hunters throughout colonial America who operated similar schemes using supernatural fears to cover systematic murder for profit? Leave your comment below with your theories about how many other divine judgments might actually have been calculated crimes. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries about the dark side of American history. See you in the next video where we'll explore another case of colonial evil that most people would rather forget.